It's Wednesday, January 18th, 2023, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Smith Forum in the Reynolds Journalism Institute this week. So if you're listening on the radio, you may notice it sounds a little different. It's not quite as clear, a little tinny maybe. And if you're watching us, it definitely is going to look different. You can see right now we're in a much bigger room with a different look to it, and that's because our normal studio in RJI's Futures Lab is undergoing some renovations this week. We hope to be back there next week, but we are still the same old crew. I'm Amy Simons here alongside my colleagues Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, we're going to talk about Representative Matt Gaetz's amendment to bring C-SPAN's cameras back to the House floor to make those live camera feeds live again, for real, like they were during the House Speaker votes a couple of weeks ago. There are some valid arguments, both for and against. As state governments across the country are beginning to issue bans on TikTok, colleges and universities in those states are restricting access to the short video app TikTok on devices and Wi-Fi networks. We're going to talk about how student journalists are reacting on some of those campuses and update you on what discussions might have been going on here at the University of Missouri. And those docudramas on TV and streaming sites, the ones based on a true story, some parts aren't exactly historically accurate. We're going to talk about why that's bothering the people portrayed in them and the effect that it's having on our collective memories. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with the first public radio station staff in the state of Missouri to unionize. Thursday, St. Louis Public Radio staffers notified management of their intent to form a union with the Communication Workers of America. This is the latest in a series of public radio stations to make the move. NPR, Marketplace, WBEZ in Chicago, I believe WAMU in Washington, D.C., and several others. What is the Guild looking for in this case?
Well, I think this is part of a wider trend in society. It's not just in the news media, although you can certainly understand the reasons there'd be, it would be particularly salient. I think it's less a reflection on the employers than on the overall economy that really has put, for many, many years, decades really, it was a buyer's market, and employees were less empowered. And I think certainly when I started out in the business, there was this attitude that somehow if you were a union employee, you were less than, you were blue collar, you were salaried. But I think what you're seeing across the society as more of our society is becoming white collar workers, there are more people saying, hey, I need to build in some security for myself. And, we've talked about it here. I think, interestingly, it's being motivated by a younger generation that wants more balance in their work-life equation, and they are looking for ways to achieve that, and collective bargaining is one way.
Collective bargaining is, and the people who organized in this case, they have acknowledged there have been some cultural issues in that workplace, and that's one of the things they're really looking to try and find ways to solve, or at least continue to work towards a different direction. They acknowledge there have been efforts made, and there have been some gains made, but it's still not a place where they're on the whole, comfortable working.
Yeah, especially when you start talking about public radio. I mean, one of the things that has been a long-standing issue in that particular area is a lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion, a lack of people of color, a lack of people who maybe come at it from a different perspective, and the fact that their audience sort of tends to lean more white, more liberal, and that's been the issue. And so that's something that all of these public radio stations have been dealing with. Most of them are in metropolitan areas, and they've been dealing with that. The other issue that I think that they've been dealing with, which really comes out of the pandemic, and this goes back to some of the things that Kathy was talking about, is not just the security, but to have some level of sort of balance and to be more transparent about what these organizations are doing. In particular, what do the finances look like, and what is that going to look like going forward? And how do we as employees play a role in that if we're talking about public radio? Because they are right now dealing with some financial headwinds that is also a part of what happened during the pandemic.
Yeah, another longstanding issue with public radio, and it's been called out at NPR, is the use of, certainly at the national level, the use of part-time employees. And when I was working at WAMU in Washington, I heard many complaints from people because there was a lot of crossover. People would work at both WAMU, which is the local, and the KBIA of Washington, I like to call it, and then the national headquarters. And there were a lot of people who they would work just enough hours that they did not qualify for health insurance. And ultimately, the Washington Post did a big story about that. So I think that's another pressure that's real in some of these public radio stations.
So one of the other things that is not unusual for public radio stations, in fact, it's the case here with KBIA, with KCUR in Kansas City, and with St. Louis Public Radio, is that the license is held by the University of Missouri, St. Louis Public Radio being based at UMSL. And it appears that the station employees have the support of their general manager in terms of having this union be recognized, but the real group of people that need to recognize it, it's not necessarily the management at the station level, it's the curators of the university. And I reached out yesterday to the University of Missouri's News Bureau to see if there was any comment or any indication as to what the curators might be thinking about or moving in that direction, and have not heard back yet. They don't have an update for us yet on that.
Yeah, that's going to be the interesting part because, like you said, I mean, the license holders is a government entity, the board of curators and the universities. And what we've seen, it's especially as it relates to graduate students, which is also, there's been a reluctance on the part of the board of curators and others to acknowledge these unions and to certify them and to go about that.
And that's gone to court.
And that's gone to court. And the
curators lost.
And the curators lost. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in this instance, because I do think that if you see St. Louis Public Radio, the union acknowledged by the Board of Curators, you could see the same thing happen at KCUR. Who knows, it could even happen here. I mean, it's just, it is, as you said in the opening, it is a wave. And really, what is that about? And is it going to be cooperative or is it going to be adversarial?
Okay, so speaking of the News Bureau and of Christian Basie, I asked him about our next topic too. Across the country, TikTok is being banned on college campuses. The big headline here in mid-Missouri at MU, it's not banned, and there are currently no talks of banning it. But as classes are starting back up at other SEC schools, such as Auburn, Georgia, and Texas A&M, students are finding they can't access the short video app on their phones when connected to university Wi-Fi. At the University of Florida, students and faculty have been discouraged from using it, but there has not yet been a ban put in place. This is all because 19 states have already banned the app in some fashion from use on government-issued devices, and that includes on university Wi-Fi systems at public universities. And that spending package that President Biden signed at the end of 2022, it also had a piece in there that prohibits the use of TikTok on devices owned by most federal agencies. Now, the concern here is primarily one of cybersecurity, and a lot of these bans have been in Republican-led states, and on the federal level, Josh Hawley's been at the front and center of this.
Yeah, but I think this is something where you're going to see a lot of bipartisan agreement. I think there is a lot of concern across the board about espionage.
Okay.
And there was a big New York Times magazine piece recently about TikTok's origins. And there's a lot of evidence that while the founder may be very well intentioned, if you're doing business in China, you're under a lot of pressure to turn data over to the government. And that's really the concern that we're seeing a lot of people express. Mark Warner, who is a Democrat and also came out of the tech world, he was a tech executive, has also expressed concerns about this. It'll be interesting to see Maria Cantwell's position, senator from Washington, who also came out of the tech industry. So I think it's a very difficult situation for academic institutions because there have been a lot of really wonderful research collaborations with Chinese scholars, and you don't want to lose that. But I think there is genuine concern, and I think with good reason, what a lot of us don't understand, it's not just young people, when you are logging into an app or having any kind of an online transaction, you're leaving a data trail. And the terms of service are way too long for all of us to read, and we're usually in a hurry, and we click yes, and we really don't know what we're agreeing to, and where is that data ending up?
Is that something, though, for the government to be restricting, or is that a choice of putting an app on a private device that you own, and it's a buyer beware situation?
I think it's a buyer beware position, but I also think that I think the government does need to play a role in this, especially when you start talking about the fact that you can be tracked. Mm-hmm. And there's so much interconnectivity between what we do in our private lives and what happens in public. And that interconnectivity can be exploited by various governmental entities, including China and others. And I think that's where you're seeing this bipartisan, where they're saying, wait a minute, this isn't about whether we're talking about Democrat or Republican, right or left. This is about national security as a whole.
Yeah, and even the most dogmatic libertarians will say national security is the one thing that is the federal government's responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think part of the issue here, too, is that we've had a generation, maybe a generation and a half, that is all about building a brand. And TikTok has become one of the central ways in which they build their own personal brand. How do you roll that back, or how do you put safeguards in place where people are going to still be able to do that but not feel as if they're actually losing something?
So there's a piece on our links blog that gets into some of this and talks to some of the student journalists that are at Auburn, and they had said too that okay, if we can't connect to TikTok anymore, those short videos we've become so used to producing, we'll just go ahead for our student publications and move those to Instagram Reels, looking at ways to find similar functionality on apps available here. And ironically, or maybe not so ironically, that's what we see with the Chinese app WeChat, that so many of the functions within that are the apps that we use every day in the West and have all been wrapped up into one, in part because of the ability to surveil. But the functionality, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta have chased some of that functionality that's so popular in Tencent's apps and in ByteDance's apps to include that and to create that alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can argue, well, we're favoring a U.S. company in banning TikTok. But again, I think the
same way that the Chinese would say that they're favoring their own by blocking
blocking
Meta.
So it becomes a trade issue as well. But again, I think this is such a new world that has kind of accreted as people have innovated on top of innovation. And we really haven't stepped back to consider the implications of that. And I think that's what you see a lot of lawmakers doing, is say, well, wait a minute, time out, let's take a look at what's really happening here.
Well, and the interesting part about this is from the Chinese perspective, WeChat, TikTok, they're looking at it from a governmental standpoint. Whereas in the West, we're looking at it from a commercial standpoint. And that's where I think the differences really come into play, because at least in our government, we don't want to stifle that commercial aspect of it. Whereas in China, it's all about we actually own the commercial space. The government does. And so it's a really different both economic as well as political perspective when you look at it.
Yeah, I think that's the global nature and the trans-border nature
Right.
of these businesses makes them very hard to regulate. And it's very difficult to figure out, again, what's happening with that data. I mean, a young person of my acquaintance who will go nameless because of a relationship, family relationship, said to me at one point, "Oh, I've got 10,000 followers on TikTok," and I
I'd
didn't
be
want to
afraid of
say,
that.
"Honey, how many of them are real people?"
But that's a legitimate concern,
Yeah, no,
right?
I
How
mean-
many of them are bots? How many of them are? I spend more time blocking new followers on Instagram than anything else.
I mean, this is an issue that we could go down the rabbit hole and spend the
Yes,
entire show.
yes, yeah.
Don't
An
give me
entire
any
semester.
don't give me
Yeah.
any ideas. But I do have another tech story that I want to talk about while we're sort of on the subject, and that's ChatGPT. It's a new AI-powered chatbot, and it's the latest tool that is set to disrupt writing and publishing as we know it. It uses artificial intelligence to answer questions and carry on conversations through multiple queries. As those strings come together, users can get entire chains of text, which can read as naturally as something written by you or by me. Well, maybe by you. I don't know about me. Google has indicated that it's already having an effect on search results, and educators, namely me, are worried about students using it to cheat on written assignments. And what we're also hearing and seeing is that some news organizations are putting it to work to write features on evergreen topics. CNET, one of them.
Yeah, this is really scaring educators.
Oh, tell
right
me
now.
about it. That's how I spent my winter break, was freaking out about it.
I mean, there's a lot of articles going back and forth as the semester starts, both in secondary school as well as in higher ed, about how are you able to differentiate between what a student is turning in. Is it being created by the student, or is it being created by this artificial intelligence? And now we're in a space where if whatever you're reading, whether it's coming in the New York Times, it's in CNET, it's in Adweek or wherever, is it being written by one of these AI machine generated operations, bots,
Yeah.
or is it being written by a real person? Is it being edited by someone before it gets out?
Well,
just
apparently
don't
not.
know.
I added
Yeah.
another story to our links blog early this morning that I'm not sure that you caught. An article from Futurism that found several weird and dumb inaccuracies that were a result of it. So perhaps that editing isn't happening at the level that it should be.
And the thing that bothers me about this is that, when you read these stories, they're saying, well, we're making sure that we are using this for good. Well, how often have we heard that? I mean, we're concerned about disinformation and misinformation. We're concerned about national security. We've talked about that. We're concerned about being tracked and this sort of thing. And here we go again down another technological innovation where, if we're not careful, can be used to basically continue
Just outsource our
Yes,
judgment
yes,
again.
yeah,
well,
absolutely, yeah.
I want to just say that one of the grad students in Ernest's program sent out a memo the other day that was fascinating about suggesting ways to counter the use of this to basically plagiarize. And, I think...
Is it plagiarizing if it's a robot?
Well...
I know that's a philosophical question.
You're using artificial intelligence instead of your own.
Okay, go ahead.
that
Hey, that's
would be my
unauthorized
argument.
help. So if you're familiar with the
Exactly.
University of
Yes,
Missouri's integrity
exactly.
policy. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
But
back to
But I
Chad's.
think you put out, one of the articles on the
Yeah.
Links blog is about a Princeton student who's created an
Uh-huh.
app to spot this. And I entered some of my recommendation letters that I've been writing recently for students into the bot, and I'm pleased to say that it determined that it was written by a human.
Oh, well, that's good.
So that was
That's a
very
plus.
reassuring. But I think these are just things that that we're going to have to deal with. But one of the things I would say to anyone tempted to use this for an
Don't.
assignment that
Oh,
they
wait,
should be
go
writing
ahead.
themselves. Yes, you know, murder will out. But the other idea is, don't you have a brain of your own? Are we going to outsource that as well. And
Well, but think about it. Look at all the other things that we've outsourced. I mean, it's like when you can press the easy button, most people will press the easy button, and this is another easy button to press. Especially if the chances of you getting whatever it is that you're trying to get, it be it an A or be it a good publication or something like that, is more likely to happen by going this route as opposed
And
to
it's just-
really spending
It's
the
a
time and
new
doing it.
way to cut
Yeah.
a corner.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
it's not really new, though. I mean, there's also a piece on our links blog that goes back to 2015, back when you and I were sitting here with Mike McKean, about the Associated Press using artificial intelligence to write earnings reports.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that this has been talked about as it's one of the magic bullets that fascinates news executives who would rather not pay people who need health insurance, and figure out ways. Oh, we could write the city council, the routine meetings, get an AI, a bot to do it. And the problem is, as you pointed out, Amy, you're going to have real bloopers that will. We've seen instances where there's been a consolidation of copy editing and layout desks in a city that's doing some other city's newspaper layout, and they make big mistakes because they are not physically there. And the same thing is, I have certainly found in my experience as a reporter that the best stories I've gotten, the best quotes I've gotten, are from being in the room. Mm-hmm. And you observe interactions between people, you get a sense of what's going on that you can't if you're not there. Mm-hmm. And so it is corner cutting for the news media companies too, and I hope they get off that. I'm not saying there aren't some uses for AI, but I think Ernest is right. We really have to think about what the downside is.
Well, we've been off for a few weeks. This is our first week back after the holidays. So I want to back up a bit and talk about the election of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy 2 weeks ago. It was a long process, 4 days long, and I'm not exactly proud to tell the world. I watched just about every minute the House was in session that week. But I could, because without House rules in effect at that point, there weren't any limitations on C-SPAN's cameras. And C-SPAN was able to shoot and broadcast and provide pool camera feeds that the cable news networks and websites streamed gavel to gavel and then some. And it was kind of nice being able to have that free and open view into the people's house. We got to see all kinds of really cool stuff. We saw those side conversations. We saw, I can tell you what I was doing at that point. I actually almost missed that. But we were able to see those side conversations. In your fist fight, we were able to see George Santos sitting by himself when nobody would talk to him. It was a really interesting look into it. Matt Gaetz is now saying we should keep that level of access.
He's not the only one.
Yeah, he's not the only one. I think we should keep it.
Well, he's the one who introduced it first, so we'll give him the credit for that.
I mean, I think we should keep it. Because, again, the American public gets to see those that it elects in action.
The good,
doing
the bad, and the ugly.
good, the bad, the ugly, doing the people's work. What it also proved is that you can do this without the disruption that they claimed it would bring. Okay. And because the cameras were there, none of the lawmakers even noticed that the cameras were on until after
ask the guy who went
showed
after
up. And
Mike Rogers.
Yeah.
Thank you. I forgot his name as we were going. Yeah.
And here's the thing, C-SPAN has already proven over the course of its existence, its ability to be able to do this work in a nonpartisan way that really shows the full picture of what's going on. And I think it should not only be in the House, I also think it should be in the Senate.
Yeah. Full disclosure, as the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies, I signed a letter that's being circulated by a number of press freedom groups to let free C-SPAN.
Okay.
And there's another lawmaker who actually may have been before Gaetz, Mark Pocan, I think his name is, from Michigan, who I think is a Democrat. But I think there's going to be bipartisan support for this. There's also going to be bipartisan opposition. And where you're going to see it is the senior leaders aren't going to want it, of both parties. The junior members are going to want it because it's an opportunity. And really, it was a then junior member of Congress, Newt Gingrich, who figured out the power of C-SPAN very early and used it to his benefit. So it's an opportunity for people who normally aren't showcased, the backbenchers, to really show themselves for what they are. And it's an opportunity for the American public to see what we reporters have gotten to see all along, which is the real drama that happens on the floor. And I think, Ernest, if the Senate would do the same thing, we might see more members of that distinguished chamber in the chamber, which is the great debating society. The dirty little secret is nobody's ever there to debate.
Right.
And I think Karen Tumulty, a friend of mine who works for the Washington Post, did a really interesting column recently on what the rebels had right. And I think the idea of more open debate and a more genuine give and take, it would be really, really healthy. And we don't have enough of it in either chamber, but particularly in the Senate.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we go, I want to talk about something that's been popping up in so many of those historical docudramas that are out there on streaming right now, like the one on Jeffrey Dahmer on Netflix, or the 1970s LA Lakers on HBO, or The Crown.
Why is everyone being odd?
Ma'am?
It started on the Royal Yacht.
What started, ma'am?
People being odd with me. You're being odd now.
Am I?
What's going on?
An unkind, silly, inaccurate article in the Sunday Times. Not worth thinking about.
Don't you think I ought to be the judge of that? Do you still have a copy?
That scene depicted the Queen finding out that her staff had been keeping her from seeing a story on the front of the Sunday Times suggesting she'd stayed on the throne too long and needed to abdicate. Only the staff didn't hide the paper from her. That was made up. And that happens a lot. There's also been talk about the HBO series Winning Time, where Jerry West has demanded a retraction and apology for the portrayal that has been made of him in that program.
Yeah, and he's got the backing of
Kareem
Abdul-Jabbar and Mitch Kupchak and others who were around him at that time, saying none of this ever happened. I mean, it showed him yelling, showed him drinking at the office, showed
throwing
him
the statue.
throwing the World Championship statue into a wall, and none of that ever happened. And he's saying, look, if you want to base it off of the book, then base it off the book. You went off script and even going past what the book had said and created this basically for people to want to watch the show, and none of this ever happened.
And this happened in 2019. There was a movie by Clint Eastwood called Richard Jewell that was about a real-life drama, and it inserted a false story about a female reporter who was dead and couldn't defend herself, supposedly trading sex for a news tip, which is the oldest trope about women reporters in the book. So it's a terrible thing, I think.
Yeah.
And what this does, and we only have a few seconds, but Ernest is our historian, it really kind of reframes inaccurately our collective memory of the past.
Absolutely. I mean, people think that this is what really happened when in fact it wasn't a part of what's going on, and it takes everything out of context, and that's the important part of it. There's nothing wrong with docudrama, but you want to get as close to the truth as possible and not just insert things.
And be transparent.
And be transparent if you're not. Yes.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank you for spending your last half hour with us. You can read more about all the stories we talked about on our links blog. That's under both the podcast and programs tab at kbia.org. We're on social media. We are wherever you find your podcasts. I'd like to thank Travis McMillan for directing today's show, Takia Thomas for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher had composed our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.
Hey, are we back in studio next week?